Good afternoon and a warm welcome to everyone. We'd like to thank you for sparing the time to join us for this webinar on equipping employers regarding changes proposed by the four labor codes. There have been a number of webinars and discussions around the labor codes, and there are questions and ambiguities which most of us do not have answers to just yet. In that context, we'd like to discuss specific takeaways from the labor codes while trying to understand the practical outcomes of changes that are expected from an employer and employee perspective, and what HR and finance professionals need to consider in the way various business processes are run to make them more relevant to the upcoming regime and anticipated preparations to be labor code ready by the time the rules are notified. We'd also like to point out that the codes are yet to be enforced until the time the provisions of the labor codes gain effect in their entirety. At least from a compliance perspective, nothing really changes for you, and the existing compliances shall hold good. And while public comments have been invited for the draft rules, we thought that now is a good time to take a look at some of the concepts and try and understand how employers need to prepare themselves. And we'll also then briefly touch upon some of the key areas that may potentially impact the employers once the labor codes get enforced. And in order to better understand the practical implications, we've decided that instead of going into a detailed presentation, which we have already done in the past, today we'll take a look at what views industry luminaries might have in this regard. And I also wanted to highlight that this session has been recorded in advance, and this will be followed by a question and answer session. Today's discussion will primarily be based upon benefits and concern areas of the four proposed codes. Then we'll go on to changes in wage structure and fixed term employment, followed by principal employer and contractor relations with regard to wage payment. And lastly, we'll discuss the way interstate migrant workmen have been dealt with under the labor code. This is Abhishek, and now I request my colleagues Aditya, Ananya, and Kanishka, who are fellow lawyers in Lexplosion with extensive experience in regulatory compliance management and audit, to join me in taking our viewers through these. Beginning our discussion today with the concept of wages. Over to you, Aditya.
Thank you, Abhishek. Wage and its component, what are included, what are not included, always impacts the employee's salary and the statutory contributions from an employee-employer's perspective. Now, this new definition of wage has three components to it. So it has inclusion, it has exclusion, it has a condition to the exclusion. Now, when we talk about inclusion, inclusion has your basic, your DA, and there is a retaining allowance. Now, the exclusion includes provident fund contributions, your gratuity, your bonus payments, HRA, housing accommodations. Now, the exclusion has been capped at 50%, which means if such exclusions exceed 50% of the total remuneration payable, then the amount which is exceeding 50% shall also be part of the wages for the purposes of calculating the PF, ESI, gratuity, and other compensation. Now, this may potentially affect the calculation of contributions to be made by the employer and employee as well on provident fund, ESI, gratuity. So this will have a cost implication on the employer.
That's really insightful, Aditya. Now, speaking of cost implications, I'd also like to add that there's a new concept of pro rata payment of gratuity, and that the code extends the entitlement of gratuity to fixed term employees on termination of their contract period. To understand this better, let me quickly take you through the concept of fixed term employment. The code defines fixed term employment as engagement of an employee on the basis of a written contract of employment for a fixed period, provided that such employee has similar hours of work, wages, allowances as a permanent employee, and is engaged in a work of similar nature. In simpler words, any employment contract which is not meant for an indefinite term is fixed term employment. And such employees will be entitled to the same benefits as a permanent employee who is engaged in similar work. Now, for instance, in case of payment of gratuity, whose minimum eligibility for a regular employee is based on completion of a continuous service tenure of 4 years and 8 months, will not be relevant in case of a fixed term employee. Now, to put all of that into perspective, for instance, if an organization, let's say company A, hires, let's say Mr. K, for a contract period of 2 years, upon completion of Mr. K's contract term, the minimum eligibility requirement would not have been met under the present regime, and hence gratuity is not payable. However, with the introduction of pro rata payment of gratuity under the labor codes, Mr. K, who has been working on fixed term employment, will be eligible to receive gratuity once he completes his contract term of 2 years. This may also have direct cost implication on organizations where workforce consists of people hired on a fixed term basis.
Abhishek, I just want to add a couple of points here. The fact that employers now have the flexibility to hire workers based on their requirement through written contract. With this, the flip side is that while employers may not need to retrench or dismiss people, they will still have to pay the same benefits to fixed term employees as that of permanent employees in terms of, like you said, hours of work, wages, allowances, and other benefits, including statutory benefits like gratuity, which now is payable if an employee has been in continuous employment for at least a year. So I'm wondering if that would essentially mean that a fixed-term employee will benefit over a permanent employee since they still have to be employed for a period of 4 years and 8 months to be eligible for gratuity. And to Aditya's point, where he was talking about wages and provident fund and gratuity, I think some of these are very critical to the relationship of a principal employer and a contractor.
Definitely, Ananya. The relation of the principal employer with the contractor and the contract laborers, especially with respect to timely payment of wages, has always been critical to people's management and peaceful functioning of organization and industries. To further ensure timely payment of wages to the contract laborers, the wage code rules, which is currently in the draft stage, adds additional responsibility on the principal employer, where they will have to clear the dues of the contractor prior to the contractor making payments to the contract laborers. So in a way, we can say the salaries of the contract laborers, when the contractor pays the salary, prior to that, the principal employer will have to clear the dues of the contractor. So this may lead to the principal employer and the contractors relooking at their agreements, contracts, and also the payment terms.
So in fact, Aditya, since you mentioned contract labor, I think, since we are talking about the four codes, I think we should definitely talk about the interstate migrant workmen as well. The definition of the interstate migrant workmen in the the proposed codes have completely changed. So currently, of course, interstate migrant workmen can only be hired by or through contractors only. But in the proposed codes, that changes. So a person directly recruited by an employer, if he's of course working in the destination state, are also covered. In addition to that, people who have come on their own to a destination state to seek employment are falling in the ambit. People who have changed organizations after coming to a destination state are also falling into the ambit. So a large number of people who were not considered interstate migrant workmen in the current regime are now because of the proposed code, of course, are falling into the ambit of interstate migrant workmen. So which definitely brings in a lot of responsibilities towards the employers, which is of course an interesting thing to talk about, especially on the employer's perspective, because of course there is a threshold of 18,000 rupees that above which you would not be an interstate migrant workman, but still the scope definitely enhances. Additionally, of course, you have to, provide certain benefits like journey allowances. Interstate migrant workmen now are eligible for the PDS as well. So, and interested migrant workmen can now even, enroll themselves to the portal and register themselves as interested migrant workmen. So a lot now changes for an employer in dealing with interstate migrant workmen. So in fact, with that note, today, to take our discussions further, today we have with us two luminaries of the industry who have joined us to share their insights on the upcoming labor codes. So let me quickly introduce both of them. So let me first introduce Mr. Samar Banerjee, who is the Chief Human Resource Officer at Vista Limited. He has over 25 years of multi-domain HR, ER experience ranging across a multitude of industries. He has singularly designed, launched, and integrated an employee portal service with multitude of functionalities and has served as the backbone of many HR processes. We'll also like to introduce Mr. Dipak Roy, who is the People Director at DP World with 28 years plus experience in managing human resources across several industries. He has led transformation projects on major growth initiatives, large-scale businesses, consolidations across geographies. He's also been involved in building hyper-growth workforce engines for resource planning and hiring more than 10,000 employees a year with active involvement in CSR activities. So welcome, Mr. Banerjee, welcome, Mr. Roy. Welcome, of course, to our webinar on equipping employers to propose changes to these the 4 labor codes which are coming in. So we have been discussing, we have been talking about some of the key highlights, the key takeaways of the code, and we wanted to extend this discussion with you. But in order to probably extend it, we have formulated a few questions. So Mr. Roy, I'll start with you. Between what is there currently in terms of law and what the labor codes are introducing, what, according to you, are the benefits?
So, first of all, let me put a disclaimer saying that whatever I speak, these are my personal views and not views of my company where I work. To me, I think this is a very welcome change. Although all of us who have been practitioners of human resources and industrial relations have actually, in a way, struggled through several laws and definitions of very simple thing like who's a workman or who's an employee or what a wage means has been so complex in different laws. So to put together close to about say 40 odd laws and combine them in 4 codes, to me is a big welcome change. This is a change which, including the large industry bodies like CII have welcomed and have participated along with the government in making this. Undoubtedly, this brings in a lot of simplicity from the multiplicity which happen. Simple thing like, as I mentioned, who's a workman or who's an employee has clearly been defined. The inspector or the inspection Raj, which many of us often use this word, has now become more of a facilitator, and that's what it has been defined. Government is also looking at usage and ease of usage of technology for better compliance and implementation of these laws. Those are some, I think, to me, are very important aspects. Then when you get into each of these, whether it's the wage code or on health and safety or on social security, one can detail out as to what each of these codes are going to bring in benefit. And as we speak further, we can detail these out. So to me, this is an absolute welcome change, I would say.
That's great. In fact, although all labor laws, the perspective or the major purpose is to help, employees in general or workers in general. I think, as an employer, you're saying that, there are benefits for the employers as well, making it easy. So, Mr. Banerjee, on the same question, I just wanted to quickly understand from you, is there anything that you want to add as benefits, as an employer or even, managing employees, for a number of years? Anything that you specifically want to add?
Good evening. At the outset, I'd like to thank Team Lexplosion, especially Kanishka and Aditya, Abhishek, Ananya for getting this organized. And I think this was a much needed event. And the way we are looking at this change, as I would agree with what Dipak rightly said, it was all about simplifying. So if you look back and put things in perspective, what you will notice that the way the legal compliances requirement has evolved with respect to labor in our countries. So one, they were slightly outdated in terms of the way and the time they were implemented, promulgated. Second, there were multiplicity and quite a bit of ad hocism in the entire process. So now when we are moving on to a business era where it's talking about ease of doing business, where we are talking about digitizing the entire delivery mechanism of such compliances. So this was a much needed change which has been brought in, which is, I think, to my mind, was the need of the hour. And when we are globally integrating as a part of business and economic requirements, this was a much needed change which has been brought in at the right time. It brings in a lot of simplicity in the way things are to be interpreted in future. It is consolidating 40 odd laws into 4 codes, which is, to my mind, a humongous task. Leaving aside the burden of compliance, which all of you know that 650 line items to be complied to in an integrated unit like ours. So if that can be reduced and simplified, it removes or reduces the burden of compliance that much. Beside that, from the employee's point of view, when I look at it, it actually makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense in the manner that close to 92% of our employees are in the unorganized sector. So which really the needs are never addressed in the right way. Although they generate the most economic value to the economy, but their needs are really not addressed in that context. So when you look at the way the Maternity Benefit Act, or for that matter, the health and insurance under the Social Security Code gets extended to those set of people, I think it's a more inclusive and more future looking way that the government has actually introduced.
That's wonderful. So in fact, of course, we all agree on the benefits, but of course, the law is still, and the codes are not still enforced. But quickly wanted to check, from both of you, and starting with Mr. Banerjee, is that, do you think that there are concerns? There are anything, any issues that these codes are bringing in, which probably needs addressing?
I would not say there are concerns really at this point of time, because these are yet to be translated into rules in that manner. So there are still some clarity which has to emerge on few of these codes. So one very important element of which is the minimum wages floor level. So still till it is to be announced, and as we speak, I think the government has decided to form 3 advisory committees on these 3 separate codes. So they are waiting out the legal opportunities or the prospects of getting such a board constituted. Since it is not mandated in the code whether those can be constituted or not. So minimum wages floor level is definitely one area where we think some clarity has to emerge. Till the time it is clarified, there's a lot of anxiety. And for us, since we have 2 set of appropriate governments, which becomes a little difficult for us. For our mining activity, we have the central government as the appropriate authority, and for rest of the manufacturing activity, it is the state government. So which one will apply in terms of the minimum wage rate is still a question mark for us. Similarly, if you look at Provident Fund Act and the code related to which is talking about wages, how they are to be bifurcated, that 50% of the wages should comprise as basic salary and 50% will form allowance. Since in the past, the Supreme Court had passed a judgment related to the application of Provident Fund for the various allowances, whether that same principle will apply in the future, or the government is thinking about applying this to this across the board is something that needs to be clarified soon. I think by the time the law or the rules get enacted, this will be sorted out. So it is an anxiety for the short term. I don't see this as a long-term anxiety for the employers as a whole.
Okay, that's insightful, Mr. Roy. I mean, to add to what Mr. Banerjee said, is there any other gray areas that you think that is worth addressing?
So, as I understand that some of the unions, I believe, have not welcomed this as is, these codes. The specific ones that I remember are, for example, for conducting any strike, there have been some restrictions put on, made more, the reasons for doing a strike has been made tighter, number one. Number two, that the threshold ceiling for employees has been raised from 100 to 300 for a lot of applicability of these codes, which means that so far, if there were smaller companies like below 100 employees, were not as stringent from the point of applicability of the law. With raising the ceiling to 300, in my view, a lot of the small scale companies or MSMEs will be out of the bounds of these four codes in many ways. And we all know that a large number of our employee workforce actually work in these MSMEs. So from that point of view, workers and unions have expressed their concern on these four codes. And of course, there are some other things like from an employer perspective, there are some things like a simple thing like a full and final settlement has to be completed within 2 days of an employee leaving, and so on. So which makes it, from an implementation point of view, one has to be, as an employer, one has to be a lot more stricter in the implementation. So those are, I think, some of the concerns that I have heard.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. That was insightful. So my next question is for you, Mr. Banerjee. So as you mentioned, there will be a change in the definition of wage and how it may affect the PF. So how are you looking at restructuring of the salaries? What challenges you think this might bring if we look at from a provident fund or a gratuity payment from an employer's angle?
Aditya, there are two very clear-cut dimensions to it. So the first part of which is about the employee. So what the employee and the current generation of employees that we will basically be addressing to. So they are really not looking at a very long-term proposition of employment. So when we talk about Provident Fund as a saving for their future, they're really not very excited. If we say that the take home is more and your savings are less, I think that is more excitable to them. But if we implement the code and then see that 50% of your monthly gross is basic salary on which Provident Fund will be deducted, I don't think that the current generation of employees are really getting very excited. Again, if I look at the employer side, the employers will also not very keen to increase their wage bill for the reason that we know the current economic scenario and the way businesses are responding to. So it is probably not a right time to increase or inflate the wage bill. So the government or whichever the advisory committee which will be formed has to come clear on the applicability of the Provident Fund. It needs to provide some sort of flexibility in terms of what percentage of your gross salary will be taken as basic and what can be allowed or permissible and as allowances on which the social costs will not apply. So unless there is a clarity emerging out of that board's recommendation, it is probably too early for us to restructure the wage components in that manner. I think it can go either way, so we'll probably wait and watch, and till the time the recommendations come, we will look at restructuring them.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts, Mr. Banerjee. Now, also with the proposed concept of gratuity for fixed-term employment, there may be a few additional responsibilities for employers now. Now, do you think companies are likely to hire more people on a contractual basis, or will this dissuade them from doing that?
Abhishek, I think the fixed term employment or the changing labor form in terms of gig labor is what is being coined as a term. Employing employing such category of labor is going to be easy. But for us, what it actually makes real and practical sense, if we look at a set of employees who are typically hired for a project. So people who are hired for a project, once the project gets over, usually they would not have much of work to do unless a new project is coming up. So this is one set of employee who it will become easier for any kind of setup to hire. Second is today, many manufacturing companies hire contractor labor, and there is always an uncertainty that once these people complete 240 days of working, they will come and demand permanency. So since that limit is now extended to 3 years, I think it provides a lot of flexibility to the employers to hire such category of employees with a lot of clarity. So even if we have to pay the gratuity, I think that makes sense. Otherwise, the demand for permanency for such category of employee and set of incidental demands to it made it difficult or sort of was not legally permissible to employ them, but now it will become easier for us or for the industry to hire such category of employees.
Okay, and Mr. Roy was mentioning about how ease of doing business is now going to probably take shape in terms of the new labor code. So in today's context, we know that there are multiple registrations and licenses, and you need to obtain those, and then you also have several registers that you have to maintain, and there's a lot of duplicacy that is happening. So how do you think that these labor codes, and Mr. Roy, if I could pose this question to you, how do you think the labor codes are going to contribute to the concept of ease of doing business? And if you could just give us some practical insights in terms of how this is going to work better for employers, we would love to hear from you.
So, just the applicability of maintaining registers, filing returns, going through inspections, each law, and before the code. I mean, and these laws have been made, sort of post-independence. The whole volume of activities required in the most simplest form was very high. Used to be very high, and we know that many of our HR teams and colleagues used to spend a good amount of time, as I think Mr. Banerjee or one of you mentioned, that 600 lines of compliances were to be maintained, and hopefully with the simplifying into 4 codes, certainly it is going to reduce. So the sheer number and volume of line items to be managed is going to sort of reduce, number one. Number two, I think for organizations which have the right intent to be compliant, it makes a lot more easy from being a good employer. So a simple thing like enforcing or asking employers to pay wages upfront in advance to the contractor, so that the contractor in turn can pay wages to the contracted labor. I personally feel that compliant large corporates will find it a lot more. It's not about easy, but I think it's more about the whole sense of being compliant and doing the right things for the employee. I think is a positive sign. That's the second one. Third one is, I would say, we all know that this, that whole new generation is going to be for gig economy, if I may say, workers or gig economy employees. And so far, laws have been very silent about it. And now they have been brought under the purview of the 4 codes, including Social Security. So now companies are going to have clarity as to how to go about hiring gig economy workers or part-time workers in that. And the last one, I think I mentioned earlier, is that from a digital or digitization point of view, I think ease of managing registers, ease of filing returns, ease of tracking compliances will be much easier now. So I think those are top of my mind, some of the things that are going to make it easy for organizations who actually prefer or want to be compliant.
Sure. And so this has made a lot of noise, and I think employers all over have been making a lot of noise with the sheer volume, like you mentioned. And the government has tried to introduce new rules which have come out in 2017, and they have tried to deal with those issues that are so pressing in terms of having the same registers having to be maintained under different laws. So in terms of what is there currently now? I mean, apart from the laws that require you to, let's say if it's minimum wages and payment of wages and factories and all of that, and with laws that have been made specifically, let's say for registers, that you can have instead of having 8 registers, you can have a limited number of registers, and that will suffice. And also in terms of self-certification that has been brought about, all of that, how do you put that into perspective when we're looking at the change from what we have now and moving into the labor codes? How would you deal with that? And this is open to both of you, Mr. Banerjee, if you would want to throw some light on this, and to you also, Mr. Roy.
Let me take it first. Let me also bring to your notice that there is an act which specifically says labor laws simplification of procedure for furnishing returns and maintaining register of establishments. Unfortunately, this law has not been subsumed by any of these codes. So I really do not know whether we will have to maintain that 7-in-1 register as has been mandated under that law, or managing it within the Shram Suvidha portal is going to suffice. So there is probably a little bit of dichotomy in this entire change that has happened. So since that law remains to be subsumed, whether that will still apply or that will not be applicable anymore needs a little bit of clarification to come. On the other hand, if you look at the Code on Occupational Health and Safety, so which is talking about a single point of registration for contractors or such firms, which makes it easier for many of us, as we are required to say hire contractual labor for all our operations which are spread across the country. We really do not have to ask the contractor to get the licenses at every location. So to that extent, it makes it easier, but I really am not very sure whether all these registers and returns are to be subsumed, because one set of the law still exists, which has not been removed.
Well, I think that's an extremely interesting, aspect to it. And of course, I'm sure that, before everything, all the laws gets enforced, we'll get some more clarity on that.
Right.
And, we should be able to figure out. I'm sure, the purpose, however, which as both of you mentioned, is to ease, the business, ease, the employers, liabilities and, in terms of compliances. So I think there should be some clarity in the near future. We can at least hope for that. Well, I have a specific question, and this is something that I was reading about the interstate migrant workmen. Now, the definition, I was talking about this. The definition has changed. So previously, interstate migrant workmen used to specifically be hired by a contractor, by or through a contractor. Now it's also allowing employees who are directly recruited by employers within that ambit. Also, people who have traveled on their own to a destination state and seek employment at an organization in that ambit, and also people who have changed organization after coming to a destination state into that ambit. So considering all of that, and of course there are certain compliance requirements when we talk about interstate migrant workmen compared to a normal employee. And with this new definition, of course, with the upcoming codes, this increases the scope. So considering that, and so I was thinking whether employers would it be a would it actually be a detrimental effect on employers to hire interstate migrant workmen, or do you think that it would not really matter?
So, Kanishka, is it for me to
Yes,
respond?
Mr. Banerjee, if you could.
Yeah, Kanishka, interstate migrant workmen is again, the act itself is a little complicated. So one, the act is complicated in itself, and second is the implementation part is, or the execution part is even more complicated. So the complication arises on two very specific areas. One is registering the interstate migrant workmen. What is required under the act is you will have to obtain certain clearances from the law enforcement authorities. So what happens is there's certain skill category of people which are very specific to a region, and when these skills are required at a next region, this set of people move. So I'll give you one very small example for all of us to understand and appreciate. There is a work performed in heavy manufacturing industry which is called rigging. So rigging is primarily lifting of heavy equipments and machineries through any mechanical mechanism. And these riggers are typically coming from people from the regions where we have genetically disposed stronger people, like people from Punjab, people from Andhra Pradesh will migrate and come to places like Odisha and West Bengal to do the job of rigging when a big project is happening. So once the project gets over, they move along with the project team and move back to the new project. So this team of people, when they are coming, they are supposed to be registered under the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act. This requires, or this stipulates, that the local enforcement, the law enforcement authority will have to give them a clearance that they do not have any criminal antecedent, that they are to be basically be given a clean sheet, and the contractor is supposed to register them. The employer or the principal employer is also supposed to file a return under this. Since it is such a long drawn process under the existing system, so most of the time the benefits are not accruing. The benefits which will accrue to an interstate migrant labor by virtue of working in X state, although his native state may be Y, so the benefits are actually not accruing to them for the reason they were not registered. Why they were not registered is another set of story, as I told you. Now the owners of providing the benefit has shifted to the state. So the state, they will now have to mandatorily provide the benefits which are defined under the law. And while administering the benefits, they will have to mandatorily register those people as well. Now, if a set of migrant workmen is coming from Punjab to Odisha, usually what used to be done, they used to show that they are local villagers who have been appointed and they are carrying out this job. So since there were local villagers who were appointed without any kind of antecedent verification, so this was a way out. Now that it becomes easier and the state is also mandated to deliver the benefits, I think the state will also start registering those migrant workmen, one for their own benefit, and second also for the benefit of the migrant workmen. So one, it will have a composite database of such people who are moving across states, which we currently today rely on the contractor, and most of the time we also do not have such kind of data. Second, and very relevant point that I would like to also share with you is some of the states are today mandating that X percentage of employment in skill categories have to be people of that region or people of that particular state. So when we have migrant workmen also coming in and doing or are being given employment, I really am not very sure how this is going to get sorted out, because till probably 6 months ago, some of the states have said that 80% of the employment in skilled and highly skilled category has to be given to people of that state. Now, if you are mandating on one hand that employment has to be given to this, to the indigenous people or to the natives, and how will you then allow migrant workmen facilities to be extended to the migrant labor is one point that will probably need some more bit of clarification.
Mr. Banerjee, that was insightful and enriching for us. So a lot of details which you have given in this discussion on interstate migrant workmen. So I'll propose the next question to Mr. Roy here. So Mr. Roy, the labor codes now propose stringent timelines for clearing out the pending wages within 2 working days for employees who have either resigned, removed, or dismissed. So how do you, how likely it is to impact your working capital, or what kind of changes do you think it will bring to your payroll processes or your ERP system? As in, are you worried regarding the prescribed limited 2 days timeline?
So, first of all, in general, I would say that wage bill is not necessarily the highest cost line item for any organization. So hopefully, it's not a big financial, let's say, concern or a stress it could create, number one. Number two, working capital point of view, I see this being stressed. From a implementation compliance point of view, yes, the HR organization has to be on its toe to be able to make these payouts on time. So there's a bit of, let's say, if I may use the word, pressure to do things right and on time will be there, but that should settle down. From an ERP standpoint, these are configurable, so I don't foresee any issue from an ERP standpoint to be able to make these payments on time or within very tight timelines. I don't see any issue.
So, Mr. Banerjee, your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Dipak. I would really agree that from the ERP point of view, these are easy and these are doable. In fact, if you look at SAP, they have also defined timeline of settling it within 24 hours. But where we actually lag is getting some of the procedural things sorted out. So larger organizations will have complex requirement in terms of clearances, in terms of no objections, in terms of internal clearances, in terms of external clearances, some kind of roles which have market-facing roles. We require clearances from the market as well. So there is going to be tremendous pressure on definitely the HR and finance team to settle them within 2 days. As I would also like to mention that this is nothing new. If you go back to the existing set of laws, the payment of wages has very clearly mandated that all such settlements are to be done within 2 days. So this is nothing new, or I absolutely agree that your labor cost as a part of your total cost is a very small portion. So it would not really have any impact on the finances or the working capital of a company. But it will definitely put a lot of pressure on HR systems to be on their toes.
Definitely. Thank you, Mr. Banerjee and Mr. Roy, for joining. We think the session was extremely insightful and enriching for all of us and for our audience, especially on the practical aspects of the labor codes. We will now move on to the Q&A segment of this webinar, where we request our audience to share their questions. Some of the questions we'll try to address it right away. The remaining ones we'll provide our responses over email. Thank you.
thank you for the entire team to organize this. I'm sure it's been also learning from each other, from Mr. Banerjee, who is I think far more knowledgeable in this area. But I think it's a good interaction and happening absolutely at the right time when organizations are preparing themselves to adopt these 4 codes. So I'm sure the audience and a lot of my HR colleagues across who are listening to this would find this helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Team Lexplosion, and thank you, Dipak, for really bringing in such deeper insights about the HR practices. This is also be a platform for learning for me, because I haven't really interacted outside my set of colleagues in terms of expressing my views on this. And I'll thank Lexplosion for providing this platform and the opportunity. I look forward to the questions, and I'll see if I can respond to them as well. Thank you.
Cap under the PF scheme of rupees 15,000. And now if we see under the social security code, so there has been no mention of that ceiling of rupees 15,000. So how do you think at this point of time this will pan out?
Aditya, as I have explained in my earlier conversation with you, that it's a little early for us to guess or make a guesstimate as to how things will look like. As you know that the government has already in the process of constituting advisory boards for these 3 codes, and we are expecting some kind of recommendations to come. And if I am not mistaken, most of the organizations would have taken a cue last year on the basis of the Supreme Court's judgment on what all will constitute basic and what all will constitute allowances, and would have done some kind of tweaking. At a very conservative estimate, I can see that the wage code or the CTC per se might go up in several cases. But if the limit is kept at 15,000, there is not going to be much change. So I don't see a reason for hurriedly changing the structure. But to be on a safer side, we must now, or by this time, would have included all such allowances for the PF deduction. If it has not been done, I would suggest that organizations should look at it. But to entirely look at restructuring the wage structure now is probably a little too early.
Sure, understood. Thank you so much. So, Mr. Roy, I'll propose the next question to you, and this is with respect to overtime payment. And now it seems like it may also apply to white-collar employees through the new wage code. So, how do you think that will affect organizations? Mr. Roy, I think you are in mute. If you can unmute. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. It's a very relevant question. I think, primarily a lot of employees from the ITES industries, where typically people end up, working long hours, will see the benefit of this. Okay, that's number one. Number two is that from an employer perspective, I think now companies will have to strengthen their attendance systems, because we know that many of us in our companies actually don't have such a robust attendance system, so we don't track attendance typically for the white collar people. So that I think will have to be put in place. The question is going to be about what happens to people working from home, and we have seen this during this whole pandemic, people working from home. So there are some of these questions are still to be answered. And I'm given to understand is that government might want to bring in some, a cap on applicability of this. So anybody above the minimum wage, this may not be applicable for them. So let's wait and see how things pan out.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you so much. So another question which we had, this was more from the new role of earlier it was inspectors. Now it has been mentioned as facilitators under the labor codes. And also our audience, somebody has asked, will there be any grace period for employers to make these changes? And what role will facilitators play when these codes get implemented?
I think this is more of I can imagine what the role they will play. First and foremost, I think the whole the way the approach of these inspectors have been from monitoring to facilitating. I think as the word provides, and all point is that the inspectors or the facilitators or from the government know that companies are going to struggle to adopt these codes. At least for 12 months in my view. So facilitators will have to play a role. Now, how does the government train these government officials to move from a monitoring to a facilitating is also the training, apart from attitude, if I may say. But personally, as an HR professional, I would look forward to the support that these facilitators can provide. As we have discussed, during the last 1 hour, that there are many questions which are still unanswered, and these could be hidden under some rules and sub-rules and sub-rules in some pages. It could be. So facilitators can help us uncover or answer these questions.
Thank you. So, Mr. Banerjee, I have another question for you, wherein it says, how will the contract labor management, so that part change when these labor codes gets implemented, especially with respect to wages and now even the responsibility of bonuses coming on principal employers? So how will that contract labor management scenario change for organizations?
Aditya, I think the contentious issue of contractor labor will probably get simplified a bit. Earlier, it was like passing the buck as to who is supposed to pay bonus, under what condition bonus is to be paid. In fact, if I am not mistaken, some of the judgments of Supreme Court has made it clear that the bonus, the principal employer is actually not liable. And there's some tests which are to be applied if a contractor is working in multiple organizations, has his own PF and ESI registered, so it's an independent entity to that extent. So how much the principal employer will be liable to make good such payments by the law, it now becomes clear. Earlier, we used to say that there's a judgment, so for that reason we will not pay, or we never used to factor in those kind of tables into their rates. So now that we know beforehand that this is to be paid by the principal employer, it becomes easier for us to factor in those kind of anticipated expenses early on. So it's going to be probably better managed resources.
So thank you for the answer.
So I think we do have time for just one more question. Aditya, if you could probably pick one more question, and for Mr. Roy or Mr. Banerjee, and then we'll have to.
Yes. So, Mr. Banerjee, Roy, either one of you can answer this question. I think again, this is going on. How are we looking at variable pay, especially when we talk about management bonuses, salary incentives, and and share-based payment in light of the PF applicability? So, how do you see that, especially with respect to variable pay?
So I think Mr. Banerjee could have a better answer. In my understanding, other than the bonus pay, which is used to be also as per the Act, there is no other law which is applicable to, let's say, a sales incentive or any of the other variable pays. But the applicability is only in the Bonus Act, which has been carried forward in the Code of Wages. Most of it is as normal compensation. Mr. Banerjee may have a better answer.
If I get the question correctly, if you are talking about variable pay, I think the applicability of provident fund on variable pay does not really exist. So a pay which is made uniformly, universally, and equally is will comprise as basic pay, on which PF is to be applied. Now, if there is a variable pay, we'll have to see as to how it is being paid. And if we apply these three tests, if they qualify in either one of them, being paid uniformly, is being paid universally, and is being paid equally, then it will definitely attract provident fund. Otherwise, it will not.
Thank you.
I think
There are few questions which were coming in the Q&A box. So one question, if I can pick up and respond,
Sure,
I think
sure, please.
I'm slightly interested to respond to that.
Yes, please.
So this was about the fixed term employees. I think questions were coming if how do we, what are the terms of employment and so on and so forth. If they quit before the completion of the term, what happens? If I remember correctly, I think 2 years ago, the concept of FTE was implemented, and it was mandated that it has to be incorporated into your Standing Order Act. So if you have not done or you've not added that category of employees, I think it's time to define and add into your standing order, whereby you will have to very clearly spell out the terms of employment as to what will be fixed term. Although it's saying it can be up to a period of 3 years or 4 years, you will have to define as per your requirement and tell, okay, this is what will mean fixed term for us, and this is the defined period. And in that terms of employment, you will also have to very clearly mention, in case of a person leaves in between, how his gratuity or any other payment is to be treated. And one more lens that you will all have to apply is your occupational safety and health code, which is talking about providing mandatory appointment letters. In the appointment letter, again, you will have to very clearly specify as to what are the terms of employment. So the codes, although they have made life little simpler, but all of them are to be read in conjunction. Yes, earlier we were to read maybe 5-7 laws together to take them into conjunction, but today we can refer to these 4 codes and read them in conjunction.
Thank you so much, Mr. Banerjee, and thank you for thank you, Mr. Roy, Mr. Banerjee, for answering the questions that we have received. I think we've received a lot of questions on gratuity, on fixed-term employment, of course, which there are questions that we also have, and I think we'll try and respond to most of these questions. Some of these, of course, are still in the gray. We do not have a clear-cut answer, but we'll try and respond to the questions that we could not answer live. We'll try and respond these over an email. So today, I think we've overshot time by about 8 minutes. But firstly, I'd like to before ending the session, I'd like to thank Mr. Banerjee, Mr. Roy for being a part of this webinar. I think it was extremely enriching for all of us, and especially in terms of the practicality and the actual use of actual perspective of these laws, and how it will change in the practical view. So thank you both of you, and thank you everybody who has joined us today for the webinar. And of course, all the questions that we could not answer, we'll definitely write an email and answer you over an email. Thank you so much.